Hi, everyone. So this is just a brief introduction to the French Revolution. So just to like the system and the things that were going on right before the revolution started. So please go ahead and take notes on what you think is important here. And you can always come back and watch this video if you need to. Okay, so during the Enlightenment, right, France was really the center of the Enlightenment. It was the most advanced European country. And many of the Enlightenment philosophers that we've talked about, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, were centered in France, right? However, it was still an absolute monarchy as it had been in Louis XIV's day. The king now was Louis XVI, right? And there was still, no really real checks on his power, on the king's power. And importantly, during the 1700s, France was divided into three social classes called the three estates. And this becomes very important, so make sure you know this, right? This system, having the monarch, the king, and then the three social classes, was known as the Ancien Regime, which just means old regime, right? Or the old system, right? And we call it that because we're looking back on it now from post-revolution, okay? So the three estates were this. The first estate was the clergy, and those are members of the Catholic Church, right? So like priests, monks, nuns, etc. That made up about 0.5% of the population. Then there was the second estate, which was the nobility. So aristocrats, nobles, right, etc. They made up about 2% of the population. And then everyone else in France was the third estate, about 97% of the population. That was mostly peasants, right, who lived out in the country and worked on farms. It also included workers in the cities and what was called at the time the bourgeoisie, which was like the middle class. So like merchants, traders, artisans, people like that. So pretty much everyone in France was the third estate, right? But then you had these other two, the first estate and the second, okay? So why is this a problem? This is a problem because the first two estates had most of the wealth and privileges of France, right? So, for example, the church, the Catholic Church, owned over 10% of the land. They collected tithes from the people. Tithes are like money you give to the church, right? Sometimes every week, sometimes every month, right? And they also paid no direct taxes to the French government. Then the second estate, the nobility, they had the right to all the best jobs in the government, the army, the courts, the church, right? They were basically like, if you were a noble and you wanted a job, whatever job you wanted, you pretty much got. And they also paid no taxes. So now who had the burden of paying all the taxes to the government? The third estate. So in the third estate, the bourgeoisie were primarily the people who were participating in kind of the ideas of the Enlightenment. They were well educated, they were literate, they had access to books and newspapers and kind of current events. And a lot of them began to believe in these ideas of the Enlightenment. Urban workers, the people who lived in the cities and worked, they usually made very little money and they often faced starvation and famine whenever the price of bread rose. And the price of bread would go up and down depending on how good the crop harvest had been that year. So if it was bad and the price of bread went up, they might go hungry. And the peasants, who made up about 80% of the third estate, so most of the people in the country, they roughly half of their income that they earned went to taxes to the government, tithes to the church, or to the landowners to pay rent for the land they lived and worked on, right? So they were really, bringing in small amounts of money, and then almost all the money they brought in had to go back out. So, we have on one side of the third estate, we have the bourgeoisie who are educated in the ideas of the Enlightenment. And then the other side, we have these people who are just barely getting by, right? So, on top of that, France is facing an economic crisis in the late 1700s. The Ancien Regime was outdated, inefficient. It was not serving the people. The king, as I said, could really only tax the third estate. They didn't have that much money and they were already being taxed to huge amounts, like too much out of their income. And so the government of France really didn't have access to a lot of money. And because the monarchs and the nobility lived so lavishly, right, like kind of like, did whatever they want. They had huge palaces. They lived very fabulously, right? A lot of that money that they were getting in income kind of just went to the monarch and the nobility. And so it wasn't being used as the government is supposed to use taxes to, kind of support the people and support the country. And before 1776, France had fought Britain for the last really 100 years and had lost the last 5 wars. And wars are very expensive, and so they didn't have a lot of money. But they saw their opportunity to kind of defeat Britain or stick it to Britain with the American Revolution. And so that's one of the reasons they supported the American Revolution in 1776. However, that also cost so much money that France found itself struggling to really support its own country and also pay back the loans of money they had borrowed to fight the war, right? So they were really, not in a good place at all. The whole country and the government was really just not working. And kind of another layer on top of already all this inequality, these high taxes, this war, this economic crisis. There were also problems with farming and food production, right? So France's population had been growing a lot recently, especially in its cities, right? And its inefficient farms were really struggling to produce enough food to feed everyone who lived in France. And the result was that people were starving and they hated the nobles and, the monarchs who were taxing them because they're saying, we already can't provide enough food for ourselves and our family. Why are you taking essentially money and food out of our mouths? Right. And so a couple of years before the French Revolution starts in 1789, there were so many present riots that it actually resulted in what was called the Flour War in 1775. And then in 1778, there was another bad harvest due to bad weather. And so there was this threat that people would go hungry again and there would be all these riots. Right? So we have this unequal social system. We have a debt. We have a government that is not supporting the people or the country. We have Enlightenment ideas, and we have problems with farming. So you can see how that all kind of sets up, a country that is really ripe for revolution. Okay, let me know if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you guys later.